heavy silence cloaked the city as dawn broke over London, the pale light seeping between the towering glass buildings like a quiet omen. In the heart of the skyline, a luxury penthouse stood still, once vibrant with laughter and life, now hushed with grief. The space felt hollow without the presence of its owner, billionaire tycoon Edward Blake, whose recent death had shaken not only the financial world but the intimate lives of those closest to him. Framed photographs of galas, corporate wins, and lavish vacations lined the marble fireplace, each one now a haunting relic of a life abruptly cut short. A sleek black suit still hung in the master bedroom closet, untouched since the day Edward collapsed from a heart attack, just weeks before the final hearing that was supposed to end his marriage. Downstairs, in a courtroom nestled near the River Thames, murmurs echoed off the oak-paneled walls. Every seat was filled, lawyers with folders fat with paperwork, reporters eager for a headline, and photographers snapping shots with greedy flashes. They weren't there for justice, they were there for drama. And today promised to deliver plenty of it. All eyes occasionally darted toward the empty seat where Isabel Blake was meant to sit, her absence adding fuel to the speculative fire. Whispers spread like smoke. "She's too ashamed to show up," someone said. "She's hiding from the humiliation," said another. But the truth was far from those assumptions. Isabel, 7 months pregnant and emotionally worn, was lying in a hospital bed just across the city. A severe bout of stress-induced hypertension had caused her doctor to forbid her from attending the hearing. Her heart may have been shattered by betrayal, but her child's safety now took precedence over pride or revenge. She clutched a photograph of her wedding day as nurses adjusted her for. It wasn't just a divorce hearing, it was the dismantling of everything she once believed in. Meanwhile, across from the judge's bench, Vanessa Hartley reclined in her seat with smug satisfaction. Dressed in a sharp designer dress and red-bottomed heels, she played with the edge of her silk scarf as if today's outcome was already decided. Her lawyer leaned in to whisper, "This is your moment." She smirked. After months of manipulating Edward against his wife, Vanessa believed victory was within reach. With Isabel absent and Edward gone, nothing stood between her and the fortune she had schemed for until the judge picked up the will. Isabel had never been one for grand ballrooms or glittering events, but that evening's charity gala had felt different. She had been invited by a regular customer of her quaint little bookstore in Notting Hill, someone insistent that the event could use a touch of soul. Surrounded by London's elite, Isabel stood near the back, nursing a glass of sparkling water and quietly observing. She wore a simple navy gown, elegant but modest, far from the glittering sequins and diamond-draped necks that filled the room. Then, as if pulled by fate, Edward Blake entered. Charismatic and commanding, with eyes that saw deeper than the surface, he walked past crowds of admirers and directly toward her. "Not enjoying yourself?" he asked with a half-smile, surprising her. "I prefer places where the books talk more than the people," she replied. He laughed, a real, unguarded laugh. It was in that moment something shifted. What began as an unlikely conversation between a billionaire and a bookstore owner quickly evolved into something deeper. They began meeting in secret corners of London, small cafes, long walks in Hyde Park, and afternoons in her bookshop, where he listened to her read poetry aloud. He loved how grounded she was, how unimpressed she remained by his wealth. She, in turn, saw past the sharp suits and luxury cars to the man beneath, lonely, curious, and in search of something real. Within months, Edward proposed not with a ring, but with a handwritten letter tucked into her favorite novel. The wedding was intimate, just close friends and family under a garden canopy, far from the flashing cameras that typically followed him. They made their home in the penthouse, but life remained surprisingly modest. They cooked together, traveled quietly, and built their own world, away from the chaos of tabloids and boardrooms. But peace, as Isabel would come to learn, rarely lasted in Edward's world. As his media empire expanded, so did the need for public management, and with that came Vanessa Hartley, a PR manager with razor-sharp instincts and an eye always on the next opportunity. At first, Isabel thought little of her, dismissing the woman's overly friendly glances and lingering touches as part of her manipulative charm. But slowly, Vanessa made herself indispensable to Edward's work. She traveled with him, filtered his media appearances, and handled crises before they made headlines. She began reshaping Edward's image, less the man who loved poetry and more the untouchable mogul. Isabel noticed the changes. Their dinners grew silent. His phone buzzed late into the night. He laughed less, and when he did, it wasn't the same laugh she had fallen in love with. She confronted him once, but he brushed it off, said it was just work stress, nothing more. Yet, every time Vanessa's name came up, his eyes flickered with discomfort. The warmth that once filled their home was cooling by the day. Isabel clung to the hope that this was just a phase, that the man she married still lived beneath the armor. But deep down, something told her that Vanessa wasn't just part of his work, she was becoming part of his life. And that terrified her. It began on a trip to Dubai, one that Isabel was supposed to accompany Edward on but had to miss due to early pregnancy fatigue. She had encouraged him to go without her, not wanting to hold him back from important meetings. "I'll be fine," she'd told him with a soft smile, unaware that this simple reassurance would mark the beginning of her unraveling. Vanessa was already deeply embedded in Edward's professional life, and with the luxurious hotel suites, late-night strategy sessions, and the seductive glimmer of a desert city, the lines between business and desire blurred. To Edward, it felt like freedom, an escape from the quiet stability he had once craved with Isabel. Vanessa was bold, intoxicating, and relentless. She fed his ego, whispered carefully curated words of admiration, and offered a version of life that sparkled without responsibility. One night became two, then a pattern, and before long, it was more than just lust. It was betrayal. Back in London, Isabel felt the change long before she had proof. Edward grew colder, less present. He kissed her forehead instead of her lips. He stopped asking how the baby was growing, instead checking emails at the dinner table. Their once comfortable silences now echoed with tension. Isabel tried to stay composed, telling herself that stress at work could explain his distance. She knew that carrying their child meant she had to protect her emotional well-being, and so, she tucked her suspicions away, quietly grieving the intimacy they were losing. She busied herself with nursery plans, prenatal appointments, and the gentle rhythm of bookstore life, but her heart thudded with quiet dread every time Edward pulled away from her touch. It was Vanessa who pushed him to take the next step. In whispered suggestions, she told him Isabel would never understand his ambitions, that she was holding him back. "You deserve someone who fits into your world," she cooed, ensuring he believed the illusion that he was the victim. With each manipulative word, Edward drifted further from the truth. One morning, Isabel found the divorce papers neatly stacked on the dining table, accompanied by a cold letter from Edward explaining that he needed space to reevaluate his life. No conversation, no warning, just ink and finality. Shattered, Isabel demanded to speak to him. The confrontation was raw and unbearable. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her growing belly, asking him over and over again, why? Edward, standing with his arms crossed, told her it was complicated. He denied any involvement with Vanessa, claimed he was overwhelmed, that it was just business pressure. But his eyes gave him away, flat, evasive, hollow. Isabel knew the truth, even if he refused to say it. That night, she curled up in their bed alone, the silence around her more brutal than any insult. She could have fallen apart completely, but something inside her, perhaps the tiny heartbeat growing within, refused to let her break. Though her world had crumbled, she held her belly and whispered, "We'll be okay." The betrayal cut deep, but she would carry this child with dignity, even if the man she once loved had forgotten how. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet chatter, the kind that rose and fell like waves before a storm. Mahogany benches lined the room, worn smooth from years of trials and testimonies. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised, eyes alert for drama. At the front, sitting tall behind the bench, was Judge Margaret Windsor, a woman known across London's legal circles for her poise, sharp intellect, and intolerance for theatrics. She adjusted her glasses and looked over the docket, her expression unreadable. This wasn't just another divorce hearing, this was the Blake case, a storm of media intrigue, wealth, scandal, and now, death. The double doors opened, and in walked Vanessa Hartley, dressed to dazzle. Her heels clicked confidently against the polished floor as she made her way to the plaintiff's side. She wore a perfectly tailored white suit with gold buttons, a designer clutch dangling from her wrist, and her signature red lipstick drawn with precision. She offered the photographers a slight smile as if this were another press event. Her demeanor screamed victory. She sat beside her lawyer, legs crossed, a picture of smug entitlement. To her, this day was nothing more than a formality, a final stamp on a story she believed she had already rewritten in her favor. Across the room, Isabel's seat remained empty. Her lawyer, Mr. Andrew Ford, stood to address the court. Calm but firm, he explained that his client was in the hospital under strict doctor's orders due to complications in her pregnancy. She wishes deeply to be present, he said, but her condition prevents travel and any undue stress. Vanessa let out an audible laugh, loud enough to turn a few heads. How convenient, she whispered to her lawyer, who leaned back, amused. The judge shot her a warning glance, but said nothing, at least not yet. The proceedings began with Edward's legal team presenting background documents. But before the divorce could move forward, a more pressing matter took center stage: Edward Blake's sudden death just 2 weeks prior. The court had received confirmation from the executor of his estate that his final will, updated 3 months ago, was sealed and must be reviewed before any dissolution of assets or marital rulings could be completed. Judge Windsor paused, her eyes moving between both legal teams. This changes the nature of the hearing, she said. Mr. Blake's last testament will determine how this court proceeds. Until it is read and verified, no divorce judgment can be finalized. A ripple of confusion passed through the room. Vanessa blinked, her confident expression faltering for the first time. But, he wanted this, she muttered under her breath. Her lawyer quickly leaned in, whispering something to her, likely a reassurance. But behind her polished exterior, something cracked. The will. She hadn't accounted for the will. Judge Windsor called for a short recess to allow the estate attorney time to arrive with the official documents. As murmurs began again and Vanessa adjusted her blazer with stiff fingers, a shadow of uncertainty crept across her face. The game she thought she'd won was no longer playing by her rules. The courtroom fell into a hush as the executor of Edward Blake's estate entered, a silver-haired man in his 60s named Harold Whitmore, carrying a leather briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere. Even Judge Windsor straightened slightly, recognizing the seriousness of the moment. Harold placed the briefcase gently on the witness stand, entered a key code, and unlocked it with care. From inside, he retrieved a set of documents, one thick, bound copy of Edward's final will and testament, and a sealed envelope with Isabel's name scrawled across it in bold, familiar handwriting. Judge Windsor nodded for him to proceed. Harold cleared his throat and began to read aloud. This is the last will and testament of Edward Charles Blake, dated March 16th of this year. At first, the language was dry and procedural: property listings, accounts, trusts. But then came the part everyone had been waiting for. To my beloved wife, Isabel Grace Blake, and to the child she carries, I leave the entirety of my estate, including my shares in Blake Media Group, all personal assets, properties, trusts, and investments. There was a collective gasp in the courtroom. Heads turned. Pens froze mid-sentence. Vanessa's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her expression slipping from confidence to confusion. Harold continued reading. It is my wish that my wife and child live securely, without burden or worry. They are the only people in this world I owe everything to. Another pause. Then Harold's voice tightened as he reached the most anticipated section. To Vanessa Hartley, I leave nothing. I have made this decision after careful reflection, and it is final. Miss Hartley is to receive no inheritance, no compensation, and no position within Blake Media or any associated trust. The words hit the room like a bomb. Vanessa's lips parted, her eyes wide in disbelief, her body frozen in place. No. No, this must be a mistake, she muttered, shaking her head slightly. Her lawyer leaned in to say something, but she brushed him off. The crowd's whispers began to swell as Harold raised a hand, signaling he wasn't finished. He opened the final envelope and unfolded a handwritten letter, Edward's personal statement. The ink was dark and deliberate, the words heavy with remorse. To Isabel, he read, I am sorry. I failed you, and I will never forgive myself for the pain I've caused. I let pride and weakness steal my judgment. Vanessa was a distraction I should have never allowed into our life. You, Isabel, were always my home, my peace, and my truth. This letter cannot undo the betrayal, but I hope that by leaving everything to you and our child, I can, in some small way, show my regret. Please forgive me, if not for me, then for the father your child will never meet. A stillness followed. Even Judge Windsor looked momentarily moved. Isabel's lawyer glanced down, his lips pressed tightly. The power of Edward's words hung in the air, shifting the energy of the room from legal combat to something more human and raw. Vanessa, meanwhile, had gone pale. Her nails dug into her palms as she sat rigid, the reality of her defeat sinking in. Her lips trembled, and she finally stood up, voice shaking with rage. This isn't fair. I was there for him. I gave him everything. Her outburst drew the judge's stern gaze. Miss Hartley, Judge Windsor said firmly, you are not recognized to speak. Please sit down or you will be escorted out. Vanessa's eyes darted between the judge and Harold, searching for a loophole, a mistake, anything. But there was none. She had manipulated a man into betraying his wife, only to be left with nothing but a courtroom full of witnesses to her humiliation. As she slowly sat back down, stunned and humiliated, the flashes of press cameras resumed. Her fall from grace had begun, and there would be no soft landing. Just as the tension in the courtroom began to settle, the doors at the back creaked open. Heads turned as the sound of soft footsteps and the gentle hum of wheelchair wheels echoed through the chamber. There, framed by the golden light pouring in from the hallway, was Isabel Blake. Dressed in a simple but elegant cream maternity gown, her hair pulled back in a neat low bun, she radiated quiet strength. A nurse gently wheeled her forward, and beside her walked her lawyer, Andrew Ford, steady and composed. The room, moments ago abuzz with scandal and judgment, fell utterly silent. Flashes erupted as photographers stationed near the hallway captured the dramatic moment. Isabel didn't flinch. She sat upright, hands resting on her rounded belly, her face calm but resolute. Though pale from her recent hospital stay, there was a glow about her, dignity that couldn't be bought or faked. She was not the broken, betrayed woman the tabloids had painted her to be. She was the surviving wife of a man who had wronged her and left her behind, yet she showed no bitterness. Only grace. Judge Windsor leaned forward, a hint of respect softening her stern features. Mrs. Blake, she said, your presence today is noted and appreciated. I trust your medical team approved this appearance? Isabel nodded gently, her lawyer confirming that special transport had been arranged. The judge gave a short nod, then turned back to the matter at hand. As per Mr. Blake's final testament, and in the absence of any credible legal dispute, this court recognizes Isabel Blake as the sole heir and representative of the Blake estate. Across the room, Vanessa surged to her feet. I object, she snapped, voice shaky. He must have been coerced. Manipulated. He wasn't in his right mind. Her lawyer pulled at her sleeve, whispering urgently, but Vanessa shook him off, her anger blinding her to consequence. Judge Windsor fixed her with a sharp glare. Miss Hartley, you have no legal standing to object. You were neither family nor beneficiary. If you wish to contest the will, you may file a civil suit, though I suggest reviewing the language of the document very carefully before proceeding. Her tone made it clear how such a case would end. Vanessa's mouth opened, but no words came out. She sat down slowly, trembling, the weight of her public downfall crashing down upon her. She had walked into the courtroom as a woman confident in her conquest, only to find herself erased from the story entirely. All eyes shifted back to Isabel, who reached for the sealed letter her lawyer had placed in her lap, Edward's final words. She didn't open it just yet. Her eyes were moist, but no tears fell. Not here, not now. Outside the courthouse, media outlets would soon plaster headlines praising her courage. Social media already buzzed with admiration and support. "The true Mrs. Blake," one reporter whispered. In that moment, Isabel didn't just reclaim her place, she became the quiet symbol of strength, forgiveness, and the kind of dignity that outlives betrayal. The fall came fast and without mercy. Just days after the courtroom bombshell, Vanessa's world began to unravel. Her name, once associated with luxury events and flawless brand campaigns, now trended online for all the wrong reasons. Headlines screamed betrayal, the mistress who got nothing, Vanessa Hartley, from PR queen to courtroom villain, and Blake Empire exposes the other woman. The very media she had once controlled with expert finesse now tore her apart with glee. She had built her career on manipulating perception, but now, public perception had turned against her. Her biggest clients dropped her without hesitation. Calls went unanswered. Emails bounced back with auto-replies. "We are no longer affiliated with Ms. Hartley." In the world of public relations, reputation was everything, and hers had been scorched beyond repair. Luxury fashion labels, politicians, and CEOs she had once dined with now treated her like a virus. Event invites disappeared. Her name vanished from glossy magazine pages. And the worst part? She could see it all happen in real time, thanks to the internet. Mocking memes spread like wildfire. Old photos of her with Edward were used as symbols of manipulation and greed. Her once carefully crafted image had become a cautionary tale. Then came the investigations. It didn't take long for Edward's internal legal team, now under Isabel's oversight, to dig into Vanessa's actions while managing his brand. Transactions didn't add up. Unauthorized travel, suspicious invoices, fabricated consulting fees, layer upon layer of deceit. Vanessa had believed Edward was too distracted, too infatuated, or too naive to notice. And perhaps he was, back then. But death has a way of exposing everything. Within weeks, she was served legal papers accusing her of embezzlement and fraud. Frozen bank accounts. Seized assets. Her lawyer, once loyal and slick, dropped her without warning after reviewing the evidence. With no income, no allies, and mounting legal bills, Vanessa's opulent lifestyle crumbled. She sold off handbags, jewelry, even her car just to keep up with payments. Eventually, she was forced to file for bankruptcy. The woman who had strutted into court in designer heels now walked the streets in flats, shielding her face with sunglasses from passing cameras. Her apartment was repossessed. She moved into a friend's spare room, one that came with judgmental stares and whispered gossip behind closed doors. The world she had tried to conquer now looked at her with disgust, pity, or worse, complete indifference. But perhaps most damning of all was the silence. The silence from Edward, who had cut her out in death just as coldly as she had tried to erase Isabel in life. The silence from the crowds who once applauded her ambition. And the silence within her own mind, now too empty to dream. She scrolled through social media at night, watching Isabel's quiet rise as a mother and philanthropist, and saw comments like, "This is what real class looks like." It stung. Every bit of it. But there was no one left to blame, except herself. Alone, bitter, and disgraced, Vanessa Hartley vanished into the background, just another name people whispered about before moving on to the next scandal. The birth was quiet, almost sacred. In a private wing of St. Michael's Hospital, surrounded by soft lighting and a gentle hum of monitors, Isabel Blake brought her son into the world. She named him Elliot, Edward's middle name, a nod to the man who had hurt her, yes, but also the man who had, in his final moments, tried to make things right. As she held Elliot for the first time, tiny fingers curling around hers, all the pain, betrayal, and loneliness seemed to dissolve in the warmth of his heartbeat. He was hers. Hers to protect, to guide, to love. The child who had survived not just the strain of a broken home, but the weight of a public scandal, now rested peacefully against her chest. In that moment, Isabel felt something she hadn't known in months, hope. While most new mothers would spend those first months adjusting quietly to motherhood, Isabel's world refused to slow down. Just 2 weeks after Elliot's birth, she was called into the boardroom at Blake Media Group, not as a grieving widow, but as the majority shareholder and new CEO. Some doubted her. Whispers circled about her lack of corporate experience, her gentle demeanor, and of course, her recent trauma. But Isabel walked into that room carrying her child in one arm and a folder of ideas in the other. And she didn't blink. Backed by Edward's most trusted advisors, men and women who had grown tired of Vanessa's vanity and manipulation, Isabel quickly found her rhythm. She asked questions others were too proud to ask. She listened before speaking. She learned fast. And most importantly, she led with heart. Within months, Isabel transformed the company's direction. She established the Blake Foundation, allocating millions toward charities focused on single mothers, domestic abuse survivors, and women rebuilding their lives after betrayal. She partnered with community shelters and set up grants for young mothers looking to finish school or start businesses. Elliot was often seen on her hip at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, his presence a living testament to resilience. The public took notice. She wasn't a vengeful widow or a naive wife. She was something entirely new, a woman who had survived a public humiliation and turned it into a movement. The press, once cruel and intrusive, began to shift their tone. Magazine covers featured her with captions like "Grace Under Fire" and "The Woman Who Rebuilt from Ashes." She declined most interviews, preferring her work to speak for itself, but when she did speak, it was always honest, never bitter. "I'm not here to erase the past," she said once, holding Elliot on her lap during a televised charity gala. "I'm here to build something better with what remains." Her words struck a chord with millions. Wealth had never interested Isabel in the way it had fascinated Vanessa. To her, money was a tool, not a crown. She lived comfortably but simply, her penthouse redesigned into a warm, child-friendly space filled with books, soft rugs, and sunlit windows. She often said her real fortune was watching Elliot take his first steps or hearing him laugh. The empire she now commanded didn't define her, it gave her the platform to uplift others. In the end, Isabel's story became not one of scandal, but of quiet triumph. She hadn't just survived a storm. She'd turned it into rain for others who needed it. With Elliot by her side and a vision larger than revenge, Isabel Blake stepped fully into her new life, not as someone who had been left behind, but as a woman leading from the front. On quiet mornings, when the city still slept and Elliot curled beside her with his thumb tucked beneath his chin, Isabel often found herself reflecting on everything she had lived through, the love that once felt like a fairy tale, the betrayal that nearly broke her, and the miracle of her son, who brought meaning back into a life shattered by lies. There were days the pain still crept in unexpectedly, like a chill under the door, but it no longer consumed her. She had faced the fire, stood in its blaze, and walked out carrying something pure. Elliot was not just a reminder of Edward, he was proof that something beautiful could still grow from ruins. Isabel began to write, not for fame or sympathy, but because the words wouldn't stay silent anymore. Late at night, with Elliot asleep and the city lights twinkling beyond her window, she poured her soul into pages that captured every beat of her story. The result was a memoir titled Grace After Fire, a raw, unfiltered account of her journey from bookstore owner to wife, from betrayed woman to mother, and finally, from heartbreak to purpose. The book became an instant bestseller. Women across the globe wrote letters to her, thanking her for giving voice to their own silent battles. Critics praised her honesty, calling it one of the most powerful redemption stories of the decade. As Isabel's story soared, Vanessa made one last desperate attempt to claw back relevance. She signed a publishing deal with a scandal-hungry house and announced a tell-all titled The Truth Behind the Blakes. But where Isabel's words had healed, Vanessa's reeked of bitterness and desperation. The media barely paid attention. Readers dismissed it as the last gasp of a disgraced woman clinging to her 15 minutes of fame. Her book flopped within days. Bookstores refused to stock it. It became a symbol, not of controversy, but of a woman who had lost everything and learned nothing. Isabel, meanwhile, channeled her rising influence into something larger than herself. She launched the Edward Blake Legacy Foundation, dedicated to supporting children growing up without fathers, whether from abandonment, death, or incarceration. The initiative offered scholarships, mentorship programs, and mental health resources. Some questioned her choice to name it after the man who had caused her so much pain, but Isabel stood firm. Edward wasn't perfect, she said at the foundation's launch. But he gave me Elliot. And he tried, in the end, to make things right. That counts for something. Peace didn't arrive with fanfare, it came quietly, like the final page of a long novel. Isabel found joy in the little things, bedtime stories, foundation meetings where lives were changed, mornings filled with laughter instead of tears. She no longer lived in the shadow of what happened. She lived in the light of what she'd built. Her journey wasn't just a comeback, it was a redefinition. She hadn't just survived betrayal, she'd transformed it into purpose. And in doing so, Isabel Blake finally found the redemption she had never chased, but wholly deserved. 1 year had passed since the courtroom drama that had captivated the nation. The imposing oak doors of the courthouse, once the stage for heated arguments and emotional confrontations, now stood quietly under the soft golden light of a late afternoon. Inside, the halls echoed with the faint footsteps of clerks and lawyers, no longer filled with the buzzing tension of high-profile cases. The media frenzy had long since faded, replaced by the steady hum of everyday life. Yet, outside those doors, a quiet figure stood, a mother cradling the future in her arms. Isabel Blake, radiant and composed, held the small hand of her son, Elliot, as they waited beneath the expansive London sky. The air was cool but gentle, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from nearby gardens. The sun dipped slowly toward the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of pink and orange, a perfect canvas for new beginnings. Isabel's face softened into a peaceful smile, her eyes reflecting both the struggles of the past and the hope of what lay ahead. Elliot, his chubby fingers clutching hers tightly, looked up at her with wide, curious eyes, unaware of the battles that had been fought so fiercely on his behalf. A reporter from a prominent news outlet approached, microphone in hand, hoping to capture a final word from the woman who had come to symbolize resilience. "Mrs. Blake," the reporter asked gently, "after everything, the betrayal, the loss, the public battle, do you ever find it in your heart to forgive Edward?" Isabel paused for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the glowing sunset before returning to meet the reporter's eyes. Her voice was steady, filled with quiet conviction. "I forgave him the moment I saw our son," she said simply. "Not because he was perfect, but because Elliot is a part of both of us. Forgiveness isn't about excusing the past, it's about freeing yourself to move forward." The reporter nodded, sensing the depth behind her words. As the camera captured that serene moment, Isabel bent down to brush a loose strand of hair from Elliot's forehead, her smile widening with warmth. Behind her, the city carried on, life bustling on streets and in homes, far removed from the courtroom battles that had once defined her existence. Yet in that quiet pause, it was clear that a new chapter had begun, not just for Isabel, but for everyone who had watched her story unfold. The story of betrayal, heartbreak, and legal battles had transformed into one of justice served, strength reclaimed, and legacy honored. Edward Blake's final wishes had been respected, but more importantly, Isabel had claimed her own power, not through vengeance, but through grace. She had become a beacon for those who faced their own struggles, showing that true victory comes from rising with dignity, not tearing others down. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Isabel lifted Elliot into her arms, holding him close as they turned away from the courthouse steps. Their shadows stretched long across the pavement, two figures walking toward a future defined not by loss but by love. Behind them, the world watched quietly, knowing that sometimes, the greatest justice is the peace we find within ourselves. And so, with the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance, Isabel Blake and her son walked into the evening, carrying with them a story of forgiveness, resilience, and the promise of new beginnings.